Hi guys, this is Andrew Burgess from NetTuts, and this is Lesson 9 in the Ruby for Newbies screencast series. In this screencast, we're going to look at DataMapper, which is an ORM for working with Ruby. Now, before we get too much further, let's discuss what an ORM actually is. ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper, or mapping, and the idea is that you want to use a relational database, such as MySQL or SQLite or something like that. But you want to be able to work with it from object-oriented code. And an object relational mapper allows you to write object-oriented code, in our case in Ruby, and have a library in between your code and the database, doing all the work with all the different database queries, setting up database tables, all that kind of thing. You just write object-oriented code the same way you would with any other code for your project, and it will work with the database for you. So let's hop into this and see how it will work. Okay, so I'm going to pop open the terminal here, and I have this folder on my desktop called 9, so we're going to hop into there, and the first thing we have to do is install a bunch of gems. So since I'm using Bundler, I'm going to use Vim to open my a new gem file. So now we have gem here, and you may recall from our previous tutorial how a gem file works. We're going to start by saying that we want to use the RubyGems website as our source, and then let's list the gems. So the first gem we want is the SQLite 3 gem, which is just the database that we're going to use. We're going to use the SQLite 3 database. And then I said we're going to be working with DataMapper, which is the ORM. It's just one ORM that you can use in Ruby. That's the one we're going to look at today. So the first thing we need is DataMapper core, which is dm-core. We also want DataMapper-SQLite adapter. The beautiful thing about these ORMs is that you can use any relational database behind them, and they all work the same. So I'm using the DataMapper SQLite adapter here. You could exchange that for the MySQL adapter or the PostgreSQL adapter, or whichever one you prefer, and it'll work exactly the same. DataMapper offers its functionality in a very broken down way, so that you only have to include the parts that you want to include, and the rest you don't have to use. So I'm going to install 2 or 3 additional gems here. I want to install the DataMapper migrations gem, because we're going to have to be migrating this database. We're going to work with some basic validations, and so I want to install the DataMapper validations gem. And finally, I want the DataMapper timestamps gem. And that's it. So now here in the terminal, I can just say bundle install, and this is going to install those Ruby gems for me. And there we go. All those gems are installed, and now we can work with them. So let's pop back into Vim. We're going to create a file. I'll just call it dm.rb, short for DataMapper. All right, so here's our new Ruby file. The first thing, of course, we want to do is require some of those gems that we are working with. So we're going to say require, we need the DM core gem. We're going to require the DM timestamps gem. We also want the validations gem. And we want the migrations gem, and that actually should be DM migrations. All right, now and don't worry, as we go through this, I will point out which gem is using, or what the functionality we're writing, which gem that behavior is coming from. And if I don't name a specific gem, it's coming from the DM core gem. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is set up a connection to our database. We do this by calling the DataMapper setup method. We're just going to use the default adapter for the type of database which we're going to use, which is the SQLite adapter. So it's just going to look for that DataMapper SQLite adapter, that we installed. And the second thing that we pass in here is a string, which is the path to the database. So we're going to use SQLite. We're going to interpolate we're going to interpolate dir.pwd, which is our current directory. If you wanted, instead of doing dir.pwd, you could just do SQLite : / which is the current directory. We're just going to use dir.pwd for this case, present print working directory. And then we just want to say, let's just say database dot, actually we'll call it 9 in keeping with our lesson. And actually I got to put a slash there. So there you go. SQLite, the current directory /9 dot, and that should be a DB, not RB, although I don't think it really matters. Okay, so now we don't have to create that database file. Data Mapper will do it after we migrate the database, and we'll get there soon. So the next thing we have to do is define our model, which is basically just a Ruby class that defines what fields we want in our database. So we're basically defining a table in the database. So let's make a class, and we're going to call it user. Now the first thing we have to do to make this a data mapper class or data mapper class is include data mapper : resource. So I don't believe in this series that we've discussed the include keyword or the include method before. Include is similar to require, but it's different in that when we say include and we call, in this case, data mapper is a class, I believe, and resource is a module within that class. Include takes all the functions or methods that are inside the resource module and makes them class methods inside the user class. So it's including all those methods in this case, it's our user class. So now we can use those methods, and that's what we're going to use first, the property method that include data mapper resource makes available to us. So the property method takes, for now, we're just going to use two parameters. The first one is the name of the field, and the second one is the type. So our first one is going to be property of ID, and it's going to be of type serial. This is basically data mapper shorthand for the unique primary key for this database. You make other fields keys by default, or we can make other fields keys, but by default, if we say have a property named ID with a type of serial, and serial just means it's an auto-incrementing integer, that will be the primary key for our database, or for this table anyway. So let's add a property of username, if I can spell that right. That's just going to be a string. Property of, we could do first name, why not? If I can spell it correctly. First name, last name, email address, and that's good enough. And there we have our first class. And that defines a table user in our database, table named user, with five fields: the ID, username, first name, last name, and email. Okay, so now how do we actually get data mapper to create this database? We do that with the data mapper dot auto, and there are two methods you can use here: auto upgrade and auto migrate. If we call I'm calling auto upgrade here. What the difference is that auto migrate will basically create a brand new database. Even if we're just making a small change, it will clear all the data out of the database that's currently there and reinitialize the database basically in its initial state. Auto upgrade will try and make any changes to this model here. Now, this is the first time, when we run this file for the first time, it's going to create this file, we define that, and then we kind of run the queries, if you will, behind the scenes that will create this database with the user table with these different fields. However, subsequently, if we came in here and I said, oh, I want to change this to, say, user underscore name or something like that, if I call auto upgrade, it will try and reconcile our current database. It's going to open the file and say, well, we already have a users table, and it'll just try and do a rename of this property without having to get rid of any of the data that's already there. So you want to use auto upgrade because auto migrate is going to remove any data you currently have. Okay, so let's run this now and see if we can get this working. So if I say Ruby and I run our dm.rb file, we don't get any message, but if I list the files here, you can see we now have this 9.db file. I'm going to just open this folder here, and you can see it right there, 9.db. I'm going to right click and say open this with, I've been trying out this app here. It's called Base, and it's just a little SQLite database viewer. So you can see right here we've got this user table. We have ID, username, first name, last name, and email. And there we go. All right, so that's pretty cool. We don't have any data in there just yet. But before we do that, let's add some advanced attributes to this. Let's adjust this class a bit further. So let's add two more properties here. We're going to add a property called createdAt, and this is going to be of type DateTime. And we're going to add a property, and that should be createdAt. And we're going to add updatedAt, also of type DateTime. This is where the timestamps gem comes in handy. These two properties here, we could update them, we could set them ourselves whenever we create a record in our database, and we'll look at how to do that shortly. But with the timestamps gem required, it will automatically assign the createdAt and updatedAt properties. Whenever we adjust a row, it'll adjust the updated, or whenever we create a row, it'll set the createdAt time. And so that just allows us to add a bit more metadata there for our row and not have to worry about that at all. There are also some other options that we can add. Right now we only have two parameters here, but we can add a third parameter, which is an options hash. As you'll recall, a hash doesn't require its curly braces when it's the last parameter of a method, so we won't be using the curly braces, but remember these are still hashes. So let's actually create another class here. And this is going to be a class called post. So imagine this as a post. You can see the idea here is that we kind of have a little blogging system or something like that, and that we have users and they can have posts. And we're going to see how to relate these soon. So what might we want? Well, we're going to want a property. We're going to want a slug. If you're not familiar with slugs, a slug is basically well, for example, if you go to most blogs, you're going to go to www.example.com/ it might be a date or just the word blog or something like that, but it'll be / and then it'll have a custom string that is the title, or is usually pretty close to the title of the blog post, and it's a custom string identifier for that post. And of course this has to be unique for every post. So instead of having an integer index as we do with the user class, we're going to have the slug as the primary key, the unique identifier for our post class. And we'll see exactly how that works. This is going to be a string. And we'll see once we, let's fill in the rest of the properties for this class, and then we'll see how to set that up. So next, of course, we want a title. We want a body. And then let's just go up here and grab these two lines and paste those there as well. Okay, so now options. Let's, for simple options, let's just do this to start with. We can just say required is true. And that means this field is now required. It cannot be null. Now you may not recognize this syntax that I'm using here. I'm actually using some syntax that's specific to Ruby 1.9. Usually you do a hash like this. You have your key and then you have your value with the rocket or hash rocket, I believe is what it's called, in between. However, most of the time you just use a symbol as the key, and if you use a symbol as the key in Ruby 1.9, you can put the colon from, instead of at the beginning, you can put it at the end and leave out the hash rocket. It's kind of more like a JavaScript object literal in that way. So we're going to add required true to both the title and the body. Okay, so now the slug is going to be a bit more complicated. It's going to be a key. We want to say that's true. It also has to be, of course, a unique index. We're going to set that to true too. We're going to set one more option here, and that is the default value. And you might say, well, how can we have a default if this has to be unique in every case? Well, of course, defaults for all of them, we could put a default on the title here and have whatever we want it to be. You can set the default to some string or whatever it's going to be, set it to a number if this is an integer property. In this case, we're going to use a lambda. You can think of a lambda as just a super simple function. It's just basically some code that can be executed. We can pass some values to it and it returns us a value. It's not quite a full function, but that's basically what it is for our sakes. So in this case, if we put the default value of a property is a lambda, it can take two things. And notice here, this lambda is the block syntax. I'm using the curly braces so that a block will go on one line. If I use the do and end, you might be familiar to doing do and then enter, enter, end. In this case, I would have to use semicolons because do requires a line break after it. In this case, we can just use the, in this case, we can just use the curly braces, and this allows us to put the lambda all in one line. Inside the vertical lines, goalposts, whatever they're called, this lambda actually accepts two parameters, if you will, two block parameters. The first one being the resource, which is just this record in the database, this post from the database. And the second one is this property itself on the database. So excuse me. So the first one refers to whichever current record from the database we're working with. The second is the value of the slug at the time, or the slug property. So it's just an easy shorthand to say property equals slug. However, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to return the returned value from this lambda is going to be what the default value is. And we're going to return resource.title. So this will be set when the user will have the option to set the slug themselves. But if they don't, when they go to save this to the database, if there's no slug, then what we're going to do is say we're going to take the resource's title value, we're going to downcase it, and then we're going to use the gsub method, which is just a global substitution. We're going to replace every space with a dash. Now this might not be the best, the most foolproof idea, because assuming, well, basically what does this do? Down here I can show you here. If the user puts this is the title as the title, it's going to take that, convert it to lowercase, and convert every space to a dash. So then we have this is the title, and that's going to be the slug for the post. So that creates something that we can tack onto the end of a URL to give a user that post. Now, obviously, if the user has two posts with the very same name, this is going to create conflicting records, but this is just an example. You could do something better in this case. However, that's what we're going to do. Okay, so let's take this a little further. Let's do some validation. Let's go back up here to the user class, and we're going to validate, because validation, it can really be done two ways in DataMapper. The way we're going to use here is adding our validations to the option hash. So let's see, our email address, we want to make sure it's a real email address. So we're going to do format, and we could pass this a regular expression, but thankfully DataMapper has a shortcut built in for us. We can just say use the symbol email address, and it'll make sure this is formatted as an email address. If it's something else, we could also do URL if that was appropriate for our situation. In this case, email address will work for us, and if email address or URL, or I'm not sure if there are any other built-in ones or not, But you can just pass in a regular expression there and it will format it from that regular expression. Let's actually add another property here, which would make sense in a user class. It's going to be a password. That's a string. And what we can do here is we're going to require a length. And this is going to be, we're going to use a Ruby range. I don't believe we've talked about these, but a Ruby range is basically, it's kind of like an array, or it's definitely not an array, but an array might be the closest thing that you'd be familiar with to a range. Basically, we're saying that this can be anywhere between 10 and 255 characters long, our password. So it has to be at least 10 and at most 255. Okay. So now we have our post, or we have our user method. We have our user class here and our post class. But how do we make sure these two things are related? Well, what we can do is use associations. So in this user class here, we're going to say has n. Now, notice there's like has n is not the name of one method. Has is the method. N is the first parameter. This could also be has one. In our case, we're using has n, which means has any number of, and we're going to say posts as a symbol there. So a user has as many posts as it wants. A post belongs to a user. It's that simple. So now in our database, once we remigrate this or auto upgrade it, you're going to see that what this actually does is in the posts table, it adds a category called user ID. And when we have, well, you'll see when we have a post model, or when we actually create a post object, we just set the user property on it. And what that actually does, we set the user property to an actual user record. But what that does is it finds the user record's ID, and in the actual database, the post table has a user ID table. User ID column. And so that's what it sets there. But Data Mapper just abstracts that away for us and allows us to use our actual object-oriented code. Okay, we're going to do one more thing here. And that is we can add custom property accessors. So because this is a class, and these are all properties of the class, these act just like normal properties of objects that we create with a class, which means that we can create, you may recall from, it was lesson 2 or 3, I think, how we had methods, for example, def name to return the name and def name equals to set the name. We're going to do something similar here, and this is actually going to be username. And what this basically does is anytime the username is set on the class, because we're having username equals, whenever we set the username on an instance of a user class, it's going to run whatever code is in here. We could also define a username without the equal sign, and whenever it's requested, it's going to run whatever code is within this. So basically, this means we can take a value from the user, adjust it, and then store it in the database, or take a value out of the database, adjust it, and then return it to the user when they ask for it. It just gives us some extra fine-grained control. So we access these properties from within these methods by @username. And that could be at first name or whatever. Basically, this is just going to be the actual property that's going to get stored to the database. And so I'm just going to say @, and actually I want to take a parameter here. We'll just call it new username. And we'll say the username is going to equal just new username dot downcase. Maybe this isn't the best example, but it's an example of where if we say at our site we want all usernames to be in all lowercase, then we can make sure if the user, when they're signing up, they pass in an uppercase name, it gets stored as all lowercase. Okay, so this is just this is the code we're going to work with now. Of course, there are many things. If you were really using this, you'd want to make sure usernames were unique as well. You'd want to have better slugs here so that we don't have duplicating slugs. Let's hop back into the terminal here. I'm going to have to quit the base app here because we're going to reload that here. Let's rerun. Oh, we have an error here. Let's see. Looks like I misspelled property on. Does it say line 8? Right here for password, this should be property. There we go. Rerun that. Oh. Method missing lambda. Oh, I'm gotta transpose that D. And now, there we go, that runs fine. Let's hop back to our database file here and open this. Now, you can see here that we have a posts, and it has our slug, tail, body. Here's our user ID, and we have our users. It's all there. We added that password. Excellent. Okay, so now let's give this a try. So what we can do is, let's jump into the terminal here, and I'm going to fire up IRB. So let me clear this. We're going to require our, what do we call it, DM file. There we go, and now you can see we have a user and a post class that we can work with. So let's say user equals user.new. This is the way you would create a class in an instance of a class, any class in Ruby, and that's how we're doing it here. And we can do this two ways. We can either just say user.new, and notice we get a class there with, or an object there with all the properties nil, and then we can just say user.username equals Joe Schmo. Notice now if I say user.username, it's all in lowercase because we adjusted that. I can say user.firstname is going to equal Joe. User dot last name is going to equal Schmo. Anyway, after I fill in all the properties, I can then say user.save. And notice that's true. And now if I say user ID has been filled in. This one is going to get automatically filled in for us. Also, we have created at and updated at are automatically filled in. Email and password are nil because we did not apply default values for those. And so those are empty, but that's fine. And so now if we flipped back to the base app here, where did that go? Did I close it already? Here it is. And if I go into the users and go into data, you see here we have this first one. Notice the username field here is considered null. It didn't, for some reason, it didn't actually get saved, although it's saying it's saved here. I'm not sure where this error is, because if we go here, and I noticed this earlier, if I add an underscore there, or just change the name of it, if I exit this file, or exit this, reload IRB, require that data mapper file, that will have auto migrated the database. If I refresh this, I might have to close this altogether. Quit. But now if I say user, well, if I say, let's say, start a new one here, user.new, and this time we're going to pass the hash to the user.new. So I'm going to say first name equals Andrew, last name equals Burgess, username equals Andrew8088, and whoops, I forgot username is supposed to be, well, let's say user.user underscore name is supposed to be Andrew8088. Now we can say user.save, and now if I pop back into the database here, we can see that our users is, oh, that's interesting. It didn't get rid of, so I can do that right from in here. But notice that auto upgrade, when I renamed that, it didn't get rid of it. It just added a new row. So you'll want to look out for that. It just added a new row there. But for some reason, when the column was named just username, it didn't work, but user underscore name does work. So I'm not sure where the error is there. That seems to be more of a bug though, because it shouldn't matter. You've seen user creating a new user object, and we can pass the properties as a hash, or we can assign them afterwards and then use user.save. Well, there's another way to do it too, and that is user.create. We can say user.create, and we can pass it right in like this. So we can say username equals Joe, first name equals Joe, and that created and saved it all in one. So you can see this output here shows that we already have an ID, and the updated and created at times are already created. Okay, let's go create some posts. So we're going to say post equals post.new, post.title equals welcome to my blog, post.body equals this is my shiny new blog, and now post.save false. So what did we do wrong here? Well, it's not hard to figure this out, because when we have post.save false, that doesn't, it tells us there was a problem. It doesn't tell us what the problem was. So what we can do is look at the errors. So if we say post.errors, you'll notice we have this data mapper validations errors object. However, we can iterate over this with each. So if I say posts.errors.each do error, and then we're going to say, oops, I forgot my extra bar there, and now it's probably going to complain to me. Yes, okay. So let me try this again here. Let me clear this. Posts.errors.each, so we can use the each method to iterate over the errors. Do, we're going to pass the error into the block, and then we're just going to put s the error and I'm sorry, that's a typo. It should be post put s error, and we get the user must not be blank. So that was the problem. When our post, we have post here, and we did not define a user. Notice here we have this user ID hash, or user ID, property in our object here. So we have to assign something to post.user. This means we have to get a user object. So how can we get objects? There are a couple different ways. We can use user, which is their table, right? We can say user.all, and that returns all the objects there. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3 different user objects here, which is what we have in our user database. Or we can filter them some way. So if we know the key, we can say user.get by the key, and if we just say 2, we get the user with the ID of 2. And so what we can say here is post.user equals user.get2. Now if we say post.save, true, that's saved without a problem. All right, let's look at a few other ways of getting objects out of our database. So we saw user.all and we saw user.get, which takes the key. What else is there? Well, there's user.first and user.last, which just takes the first and last from the database. Now, first, last, and all can all take a hash as a where clause, if you will. If you're familiar with SQL, you'll know you'll say select all from this table where the username is this, or where the state is Texas, or where the weather is sunny, whatever you want it to be. So we can say user.all, and we can say where username is Joe. And you can see we get one object here. Notice since we used all, it does come in an array because there could be more than one. We could say user.first where user name is Andrew8088, and we get a single user there because first returns a single one, not an array. Of course, these are bad examples because usernames are always going to be unique. So these aren't a good example, but if you had a table where, you could say, if we had user's location, we could say user.all where location equals USA or Canada or whatever, something like that. And that way you'll be getting more. Obviously that makes more sense, but for our little example, these work. I should also mention that in that the get method, which takes the key, remember, also works for keys that are not integer keys. So if I say post.all, we get all the one post we have. If I say post.get and I pass in welcome to my blog, well, first of all, notice that that slug got set. We never passed in that slug, welcome to my blog, but it took the title and turned that into our successful slug. And now I can use get because because slug is the key in this table. I can use the get and pass in an alternate key, not just an integer key. Well, has been our discussion of Data Mapper for today. I hope you'll find this useful. If you've been following along with Dan Harper's Singing with Sinatra course or session on NetTuts, he used Data Mapper in his most recent tutorial. At least at the time of this recording, his most recent tutorial was the Recall app one, and he used Data Mapper in that tutorial. And I hope this tutorial helps you take your use of Data Mapper to the next level. So thanks for following along in this screencast. For our Ruby resource of the week, or of the lesson, I'm going to point you to datamapper.org. This is the documentation for DataMapper. I think I've covered a significant portion of what DataMapper can do, but there is a lot more that it can do too. So you can check out this site here. There's the documentation link right up at the top, as you can see there, and it's broken all down into the different things you can do with properties. There's a lot more options that we did not cover. There's more ways of finding, deleting. We didn't discuss deleting records from a database, but you can do that too, and there's a lot of great stuff in there. So I recommend you check that out if you're interested in DataMapper as your object relational mapper for your Ruby applications. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.